Welcome to CAE Pilot Podcast, a podcast that brings together aviation professionals to discuss life as a pilot, training, and career advice. You can find us at cae.com/CAE Pilot-podcast or subscribe to our show on your audio podcasting platform of choice. You can also find our video podcast on our YouTube channel.
So welcome to the CAE Pilot Podcast. My name is Patrick Botter, and I'm thrilled to have you along again today. You know, on this podcast, we've always highlighted exceptional pilots and the aircraft that they fly. So we've talked about people like Teresa Claiborne, who was the first African-American female pilot in the United States Air Force, Emma Henderson, who started Project Wingman in the UK. And we've also talked to pilots everything from seaplane pilots to Boeing 747, A380, and even Concorde pilots. And today's podcast promises to deliver as inspiring a story as the ones we've covered in the past. And it's my pleasure to welcome James Bushe to the podcast. Hi, James.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm great. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining you from Glasgow in Scotland.
I'm thrilled to have you.
Thank you very much.
We always start off with, I don't know if it should be the first question, but we like to kick it off with on the bright side. So everybody has that one moment in their aviation career that stands out above all others. What is that one moment so far for you?
So far for me, that has to be on my very first flight at the end of line training that I was fully qualified and fully signed off to fly the 145. It was from Glasgow up to Stornoway, which is up in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. And it was a horrific day. The weather was awful. The winds were blowing right across the runway as more often than not they are. And I just loved every second of it because it was just the combination of, by that point, it had been 15 years since I'd, first started flying. And it was just an incredible feeling to sort of, sit there at the end of the runway in Glasgow and think, I feel like I've made it. And just really excited to see what the years ahead would have in store.
And so tell us about those first 15 years. Tell us how you got this passion for aviation. I know that you trained at CAE. Tell us a little bit about your career progression.
Yeah, so I guess my sort of interest in aviation started when I was a kid. My brother was in the Air Force, so aviation was always something that was in the household. And it sounds cheesy, but going on holidays, I was always that kid that would fight for the window seat, or be incessantly pressing the call while trying to get into the flight deck in the days when we still could. And I distinctly remember I was 9 years old and I was on a flight back from Tenerife with an airline that's called JMC. It doesn't exist anymore. And I'd done the usual routine of window seat, get myself into the flight deck. Well, this was different because on that flight out, I'd noticed once we'd landed that there was a kid that had come out of the flight deck at the end. And I thought, wait a minute, he's been in there for landing. I want a shot at that. So did the routine, got onto the flight deck, and after about half an hour of chatting away to the crew, sort of plucked up the courage to ask the captain if I could stay, and he said yes. And I just remember being absolutely mesmerized by the whole thing. We were coming back into Manchester, and the ATC, the lights at night, and I was just in awe of everything. And I think that combined with with having a family tied to the RAF, it felt like this is what I want to do. I had my first flight at 15. It was a trial lesson out of East Midlands Airport here in the UK. And I just came down from that, beaming ear to ear, and sheepishly asked my parents if I could do it again. And everyone sort of burst out laughing because they'd already got it planned. It was always going to be that, of course, the next lesson's booked. And there was no way that you were ever not going to want to do this. So I did. And that's where it started. It took me 2.5 years to get my PPL. And, that was sort of through a combination of support from the family and me working. My very first job to fund the training was at a local go-karting centre in my hometown of Stoke-on-Trent. And 2 shifts a week there for 3 weeks could allow me to squirrel away enough money to go and get back up in the air. And it's funny, actually, because not too dissimilar to now, the aviation industry, once I'd qualified as a private pilot, had started to go through a little bit of turmoil. It was the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And, I thought, okay, what am I going to do here? I need a plan B, or I need something else to fall back on, another string to my bow. Because aviation, as we see right now, is, it's a volatile place to be. So at that point, I went off to university, got myself a law degree. I studied in Durham, up in the Northeast. But it was weird because literally the entire time through that process, all I was doing was sort of, looking at what cadet programs are coming up and keeping up with the goings on in the industry, on, still flying, albeit little, to maintain my PPL. And but I knew very well instantaneously, really, that law wasn't going to be for me. But still, I needed to have that plan B, and I needed a means by which I could fund the rest of my training from there. So in the years that followed uni, I went off to work in the hospitality industry. That was something that I'd grown up with. My parents had always ran bars and restaurants, and it was I loved it, actually. It was my second passion, if you like. And I thought, if I can't do, if I can't fly, at least do something that will allow me to, fund my training when the time is right. And that's what I did. And that took me all the way up to 2017.
It's funny that you mentioned going into the flight deck. I started my career as a flight attendant. I flew during university.
Oh, wow.
And I worked at Air Canada, and we were mandated to bring all the kids up to the flight deck at the time. And as often as the pilot would allow, to have someone in the jump seat for landing. And so it's nice to hear that did have an impact on people. Yeah. Which is really, really nice. But I'm surprised you didn't become cabin crew. If you're in the hospitality industry, your love of flying, and you wouldn't be the first. I mean, I know of one pilot I know who's now flies private jets, was a flight attendant alongside me, and he left to go learn how to fly. So it's, I'm surprised that didn't. Yeah, it's interesting. But one of the things that you do have to do, of course, is get your medical class 1. And that's where things that's where you hit a speed bump that would end up being, well, it was an important one, if I can call it a speed bump, but it also started, I think, one of the biggest chapters in your life, if you will. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. And it's funny, and I haven't really spoken about the first chapter of this much before now. But I actually realized quite recently that there was 2 chapters to this. And it first started actually back in January 2014. And I was walking back home through the park in Glasgow on a beautiful sort of crisp winter's day. And I got a phone call from a training provider to say, congratulations, you're through to the final stage of the British Airways Future Pilot Program selection. Well done. There's only 32 people left for 16 places, so you're in, with a great chance. And what should have been the most joyous moment in my aviation career to that point actually wasn't, because 15 minutes before that, I found out the news that I had been diagnosed with HIV. And at that point in time, I remember thinking very, very quickly, oh my God, what will this mean for my aviation career? And in those early stages, I wrote anonymously to the UK CAA to ask what the position was. And the reply came back to say that a person living with HIV needs to have a multi-crew limitation. And I thought no more of it. And, it gave me some sort of sense of relief. So I carried on doing what I'd been doing for all the years prior, which was to apply for training programs and cadetships and, go on. Cut to 2017, and I had been successful this time to the final stage with the EasyJet MPL cadet program, and I was offered a place, and I, wanted to take it, and I thought, great, okay, fine. And now is the time to go and get my Class 1 medical, and I knew that this OML sort of situation, or multi-crew limitation, should I say, existed, but was confident that it wouldn't be a problem. So I went for the medical, passed all the tests. I was going to say with flying colours then, but that's way too cheesy. You know what? Of all of the podcasts to use that on, wow. So yeah, passed all the tests and sat down with the doctor, and he says, "Look, yeah, you're great. You're fit. You're fine, but unfortunately, I can't give you this medical because you're HIV positive." I said, "Right, okay. That's not. I know, and I know that that's going to require a multi-crew limitation, and that created a problem, because what I didn't know from 2014 and wasn't clear was that the multi-crew limitation can only be applied to a holder of a commercial license, i.e. somebody who's already completed training. It can't be applied to a cadet like me." But what it did mean is that there was a sort of a strange situation whereby if you were a pilot who subsequently contracted HIV, you could continue to fly. You could get this multi-crew limitation and everything would be fine. But if you were like me, who was HIV positive but wished to become a pilot, you couldn't. So yeah, immediately I thought, well, there's clear discrimination here. And I was just in total shock, when that happened.
And we're not talking like, the first thing that strikes me when we talk about this 2014 and 2017, I mean, people have been living with HIV, living full lives, and, for, I don't know the history of it, but we're not talking we're talking a period in time where it's quite common for people to live long, healthy lives with HIV.
Yeah.
So it's just funny that we're, if you were to tell me we were talking about the early 2000s or the 1990s, I'd say, okay, well, maybe there was less known at the time, but it seems to me that we're in an era now where, it shouldn't be an issue.
Absolutely. And, I guess the first point to pick up on there is, what does it mean to live with HIV in 2021 now? Essentially, for me, I can live a normal, happy, healthy life with a normal life expectancy, and being on treatment and being on successful treatment means that I can't pass that virus on to any of my partners or anybody else, and that's the first thing. And the second thing is that you're right, the position of the CAA and the European regulator back in 2017 was based on data, science, and evidence that was from the 90s and the early 2000s. And, in that time, it was different. HIV was different. With regards to HIV specifically, the advancements that have been made, and I guess probably the only thing to challenge this now has been coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
Treatment has advanced in the field of HIV quicker than any other virus, and in our history. And what that medication can do for us and for me is make me just like you. So I was, really sort of confused, really, as to what the barrier was.
Especially that it seems there was this chicken and egg almost situation where, had you done the training first and then had your medical, you'd have been fine, but the opposite wasn't true.
Yeah, so I sort of refer to it as a catch-22. Without without the commercial license, you couldn't get a medical with an OML, but without a medical with an OML, you couldn't have a commercial license. And it was strange, and it was strange because actually, what was I asking to do here? I was asking to go and fly the same single-engine piston aircraft that I had been flying for the past 10 years. But this time to complete a commercial license. And from a risk perspective, that should be no different,
Right.
because I was allowed to retain my PPL, and that was the key thing, so I could still fly.
Is it that it had gone on and never been changed because nobody had asked for it to change, and you're the first person to ask for it to change? Or was it a matter of, sticking to a principle?
It's a good question. I think that I don't know if anybody had tried to challenge it before me, to be honest. And if they had, I guess what would have happened would be the same as happened to me. And I got to a stage of running through the appeals process with the CAA, for them to then involve the EASA, to then ultimately still be told, no, these are the rules, and that's how we apply them. And I think that, I guess the difference for me is that there was two things really. One, it was we're very lucky in the UK that we have the Equality Act, and that HIV is a protected characteristic. And I know from speaking to other pilots who are facing similar challenges in Europe now that fight isn't going to be so easy. So I knew that on that front there was something here that could help me. And then secondly, from a medical perspective, again, it was this point that the policies and procedures that were in place were based on a body of evidence that was now ultimately out of date. And that was why I thought, this needs to be challenged.
And so tell us about that challenge. Tell us, how did you go about, tackling this injustice?
So after exhausting the appeals process myself, I think that was probably the lowest point in the process, thinking, actually, I'm not sure that I could ever, I don't know where to go with this. But after exhausting that process, I took the case, my issue, to HIV Scotland, who are a small organisation based up in Edinburgh, and said, look, this is the position I'm in. What can we do? And together we sort of devised a sort of three-pronged approach, or three-pronged strategy, if you like. So the first thing was in the media. We got a LGBT journalist, Patrick Strudwick, to cover the story. And that was to sort of raise awareness, and to share the story, and to say that, hey, HIV is still, there are still injustices. It's not, it's not done. And actually, he's a real life example of someone whose life has been impacted by this. And that was sort of, to gain some public support. And even in 2017, it was bizarre because I'd done that anonymously. And I'd sort of made various appearances on TV and radio, where either my voice changed or my face blurred out, which was super strange. And I'll come back to that one later.
Yeah.
But that was the first thing, to sort of raise public awareness and drum up public support. The second thing was to get medical evidence and medical support. So, anecdotally, I knew, my own consultants knew that I was fit, was healthy. And, we needed, more experts to back us up, really. So we took that to the British HIV Association, who themselves made representations to the UK CAA to say, look, this body of evidence is in need of review, and it needs to change. And then the third part was a political approach. So first of all, I went to my member of Scottish Parliament, who took the question of, took my case to Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, and she stood up in First Minister's questions and said, HIV discrimination of any kind is wrong, and I'll personally make a representation to the CAA to encourage them to review this policy. A similar conversation was then had in Westminster, and the Transport Secretary at the time took it to the Select Committee, who debated where can we go with this, and ultimately they reached the same conclusion, that actually this was wrong, and the application, or the stance that this multi-crew limitation could only be applied to, couldn't be applied to initial medicals, can't stand, because it was that was creating the, the element of discrimination. So that process from start to finish took almost a year. And yeah, in January 2018, I got a phone call from the CEO of HIV Scotland to say, sort of, are you sitting down? And it's funny, I think I was lying on a sunbed at the time. I was on holiday. And I said, yeah, no, I'm sitting down. He says, we've won. I'm sorry, what? I said, yeah, we've won. The CAA have announced that they are going to issue you your class 1 with your OML. And yeah, go train.
I'm just wondering about people's reactions along the way, because I would, and perhaps I'm naive in thinking this, but I would imagine that as you went up the different levels, different organizations, and then to the government, I get the feeling that you must have been met with, I would imagine, a lot of support, but also like people not believing that this is possible.
Yeah, there was everything really. And to be honest, the spectrum of reactions that I had ranged from, yes, of course, we wouldn't have somebody of such reckless intent at the front of an aircraft, to, yes, of course, this is completely wrong and absolutely this needs to be challenged and this needs to be changed. And that was quite interesting, because I never knew how it was going to go,
Right.
And it was always sort of, plan for the worst, hope for the best.
Right.
And yeah, so each conversations was a challenge. But ultimately, what I did know was that the law was on my side, right? And it's interesting, because what had happened during that year is that law degree that I'd sort of never really wanted to do. Yeah. That law degree that I didn't really want to do in the first place had all of a sudden become the thing that had sort of given me the sort of tenacity to, to pick through the regulations and to say, well, actually, there's a difference here between a European regulation that is binding and acceptable means of compliance documentation and guidance material that isn't. And what was happening in my case is that that guidance material was being followed, but it was being followed as if it was, golden and if it was law. And I knew that wasn't the only way in which this could be handled.
And you mentioned that you started this off sort of anonymously, right? You were talking about your voice being changed. It almost sounds a bit like a spy novel. Your face being blurred and all of that, but that changed along the way. Tell us a little bit about that.
This was after I'd started training, and by the time that all of this was resolved, the opportunity to take up a place on the MPL cadet program had passed me by. But I thought, what, I've come this far. I just need to find a way to make this happen. And it was at that point that I decided to go modular. And started my training with CAE, and ultimately got my CPL MEIR. And it was through that process that I thought, what, the story isn't finished yet, because the 2017 was here. Here is this problem with this pilot Anthony. 2018 was pilot Anthony as he can learn to fly. Okay, where is he now? And once I'd finally secured a job, I thought, wait a minute, there's an opportunity here. It's not very often in life that people are, given a platform and have support. And I'd had an incredible platform and incredible support. And I thought, I want to tell the story. I want to tell the next chapter of the story. And the good news, because the good news is, it's not just about overcoming the barrier of HIV, it's doing that and it's getting a job.
Right.
But I thought, if I was to continue to tell that story as Pilot Anthony, all I would do was continue to perpetuate all of the stigma and all of the misconceptions that surround those of us with HIV, right? Because it would have been a case of, okay, so he's so proud, but not so proud that he won't tell us who he is. He won't use his own name.
Right.
And actually, to have told that story as Pilot Anthony, I think would have done more harm than good. Not just for anybody reading it, but for me, actually, it had been a sort of a cathartic process of me accepting myself and accepting that diagnosis, and actually now having the evidence that this won't stop me from doing what I want to do or becoming who I want to be.
And I think about it, we speak to a lot of women on this podcast who are the first to do, and they had to overcome a lot. And here you are, someone who could have stayed anonymous in a lot of ways, gone on with your job without anybody really knowing, and you chose to speak out. And I find that very, very courageous of you. But did you have, like, was it hard to do?
Good question. It was something that I reflected on for a long time, and ultimately, thinking back to being diagnosed in 2014, January 2014, to coming out, for want of a better word, in January 2020, that process took 6 years. And for me, the concern that I had with regards to aviation was, frankly, getting a job, because getting the medical was hard enough. And what I didn't want until I got a job was I didn't want to score an own goal and put another barrier in place for myself.
Right.
Once I'd done that, it then became about, okay, well, two things actually. One, I knew that the law again was on my side. There's no way in which any organization, let alone an airline, could at that point post an offer of employment and post a disclosure, have an issue with HIV. And secondly, the support that I got from the airline was phenomenal, and has been, from the crew to to my boss at the time and to the CEO. Everybody was incredibly supportive when I said that this is what I want to do. And I think that for me gave me a sense of actually, if this doesn't go well, or if this goes wrong, I know that I felt protected, genuinely. And it's an organization in which, and this is something that, this isn't a plug, this is how I genuinely feel. It feels like a family, and it feels like one in which, I knew that whatever was to happen, it was going to be okay. And the third thing, and this is probably the biggest thing, is that, and I say this to others living with HIV who haven't disclosed a lot, is it's a process. And first of all, you've got to be comfortable with that diagnosis yourself, and then you start to confide in close family and friends. And then the third step is confiding in the general public, and it's less of a confidence thing and more of a declaration then, I guess. And at that point, the important thing to remember is that no matter how somebody reacts to that disclosure, it is not a reflection nor judgment of you. It is a reflection of their understanding, their experience, and their knowledge on the subject. So whatever that reaction is, never take that back upon yourself, and let it impact you. And that's where I got to, and I thought, what, it doesn't matter how this goes, almost, or for me personally, because I know that is going to be representative of people's place. And what I want to do is start a conversation about HIV in an environment in which, by virtue of the fact of me being the first, the conversation has never been had before.
Right. Someone very wise once told me, your opinion of me is none of my business, which is a little bit of what you're saying, right? Were you surprised by the support you got? I mean, I recently was in a conversation with a group of colleagues, and I sort of mentioned that, this sort of COVID depression, whatever you want to call it, was sort of hitting me. And when I talked about it openly, I realized that I got messages from everywhere of support, and people saying, like, I feel the same way and all that. Were you surprised by the support you got?
I was surprised by, I was surprised by, some of the communication that I received in the days and weeks after I'd gone public, from people within the airline and within the wider sort of aviation community. It blew me away, to be honest, because, there was sort of guys saying, I'm in the same position as you, or my my best friend is living with HIV, and he's the only person that I've known, or she's the only person that I've known. Again, another misconception. HIV is this exclusive, gay male problem, and it's not. And yeah, it was just, again, it was just so great to be able to just have those conversations, and inevitably, for the weeks and months that followed, every time I flew with a new captain that I hadn't, seen since that day happened, of course we had that conversation, and it was never prompted by me, because that was never what it was about. But it was great because it just means that if you can just change one person's opinion, or just leave them with one fact, and one fact being that I am as healthy as you are, and I can live a normal life. It's great. And if they then go home and say, you wouldn't believe that conversation I had with my colleague at work today, this sort of the message gets out there little by little, farther and wider, and hopefully starts to change perceptions. And it also normalizes HIV. And that was the other bit, is that, by talking about it in a way in which, this is just another virus. It's just another chronic condition. Yeah, it helps to sort of hopefully change the stigma. Try my best not to judge anyone's questions. Everyone's coming from different places, and here in the UK, before I don't know if you've seen the TV show It's a Sin. I don't know if it's made it to Canada yet, but it is a TV show that documents a group of friends who go through the AIDS crisis of the 80s and the 90s. Mm-hmm. And it tells the story of what it is, or what it was actually, to live with HIV. And what that has done has reopened a conversation about HIV in the UK, which we didn't have before, because prior to that, the only thing that people knew were the public health campaigns of the late 80s and early 90s, which were quite shocking, and essentially said that if you contract HIV, you will develop AIDS and you will die. And we've had nothing in the UK since that. And again, that was partly why I did what I did, because, not to say that has reached the scale of that, but the more people that can come out and speak about what it is to really live with this today, the easier and the quicker we will change those perceptions and get the message out there that me and you are just the same.
And if we go back to your pilot career, so January 2020, you become the first HIV positive cadet to get your license. And, you do your first flight, which you told us about, and then the pandemic hits. Tell us what that was like. What was that like to finally have everything that you've literally been fighting for, and then to literally fly into a pandemic?
Oh, I don't even know where to start on that one, to be honest. It's been the most crazy. I was going to say year then, but it's not a year anymore. It's a lot longer than that.
It's more than that, yeah.
Yeah, I still feel really lucky, because throughout this entire pandemic, I've been one of the very, very few people that has still been able to fly, and I can't help but feel grateful for that. And it's it's almost by sort of divine intervention or minor miracle that it's happened that way. That I've never been on the ground for more than a month and a bit.
Do you think that the whole COVID, that COVID itself, what we've just lived through this year, changes the way people might see HIV? Because we've all said, oh, if I'm super careful, I won't get it. And if I'm super careful, I won't get it. And then, oops, one day you get it. Do you think that might have changed? And there is a lot of comparison to HIV and COVID.
Do you know what?
You hear it every once in a while. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me, that one, because it's it's taken, and this might sound, these aren't my words. These are taken from the community as a whole. Is that it's taken this pandemic for people to sort of understand and appreciate what those of us in the HIV positive community went through in the first pandemic. And that's the point here, is that this is the second pandemic of our generation first.
Right.
And those sort of thoughts and feelings of not wanting to get close to somebody, and not walking across the street to sort of keep yourself safe, they're also relatable to what happened in the 80s and 90s with regards to people living with HIV.
Right.
The only difference this time is that the majority of the population have been on the receiving side of those thoughts and feelings, and they've seen people walk across the street and and take a step back. And I had it in Gatwick Airport last week. I inhaled instead of sort of drank my coffee, and sort of progressed into a coughing fit, and it was almost like the entire departure lounge just kind of went silent, and everyone just kind of spread out a little bit. And that's what this pandemic has done. The other bit for me is that the travel restrictions that we currently face, we hope, and it's been a hot topic of conversation in the UK and I'm sure across the world, as to how we can lift them, because we are all so desperate to travel, or at least it's that sort of concept of nobody likes to feel restricted. Whether they sort of go and exercise that right is a different thing, but everybody wants to have that choice. Imagine a world in which in 5 or 10 years' time, these restrictions due to coronavirus are still here, but we know that we've got vaccinations. We know that case numbers are low, but the restrictions are still there because a country is in fear of that, that one person or those 2 people that might come in and start chain that cycle once again. That's the world that still exists for people that live with HIV. In 25% of the world, there are still restrictions in place, be it for entering the country, be it bringing in antiretroviral medication, be it seeking work or seeking residency. And this is due to a virus that is not easily transmitted. In fact, someone who is on successful treatment is undetectable, which means that they can't pass that virus on to others, in comparison to coronavirus, which we know has been so easily transmitted thus far. And it's crazy to me that we are still, living in that world.
We've discovered a link between you and someone we've interviewed here on the podcast, and that's Emma Henderson, of course, from Project Wingman. And during the pandemic, you've been involved with that organization. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so Emma actually taught me to fly. She was one of my instructors years ago up in Inverness, and have incredibly fond memories of those days. And when Project Wayman was launched, I reconnected with Emma on LinkedIn, and basically said, look, how can I help? And at the time, we didn't have any lounges in Glasgow. And I was part of the team of four guys that had launched the Glasgow lounges, and it was a fantastic time, genuinely. Not only because you could see the value that the NHS staff were taking to just have somewhere to sort of go and relax, and tea and empathy was what we were providing. And it wasn't just tea and empathy for the NHS staff, it was tea and empathy for us, because at that time, in the early days, the level of uncertainty was crippling. Most of my team in Glasgow were at risk of redundancy. Mm-hmm. And that is a huge burden, and a huge potential life change that had impacted everybody. And it was just so fantastic to be able to, get together in a room and connect with crew and make friends. Actually, some guys I'll be friends with for life, because of Project Wingman. And quite often, the only time we sort of see crew from other airlines is, when we're checking into a hotel or going through security, and you're like ships in the night, and you might have this glance, or there's always that sort of respect that's unstated, but everybody knows, the sort of day that they've had, and they know the sort of day that you're going to have. But to have the opportunity to actually sit down and talk about it, and reminisce, and and hope actually that everyone can get back to it was phenomenal. And it is an incredibly special thing that Emma has created, genuinely.
And it's just that ability to be hopeful and to contribute, because we think that, as a former crew member too, you think, the only way I can contribute is when I'm flying an airplane or I'm, serving on an airplane. But there are so many skills and other things that can be used, especially during a pandemic.
Absolutely. And that's a thing. And it was so great to see.
I think we'll walk away from this as time goes by with many more positives than negatives. Not in terms of, the people we've lost and all that, because we've all been affected by the tragedy of it, but in terms of how it changes our lives. I'd like to believe that we will have many more positive changes as a result than negative.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I think, for everybody within our industry, it is proven, just how resourceful and resilient everybody is.
Yeah.
And, to come out of this, it's not very often you read a story of a pilot or crew member that has lost their job. Often the story is, a pilot or crew member has lost their job, or they're furloughed, and they have gone on to do this, and that is just so inspiring and unique. And it just shows how awesome the people in our industry are.
Listen, I couldn't agree more. And you're one of those awesome people, and I hope that when Kamala Harris was elected, they said, girls and Black girls can now look at someone and see that they can do it. And I think that's the kind of thing that you've done, right? You've shown a whole group of people that, because of your fight, so many more now see a possibility and can pursue a career that they might not have been able to had you not fought. And I think that's quite inspirational. And you're a trailblazer in that respect. And it's been you're someone to look up to for sure, I think.
I appreciate that, Patrick.
Yeah. And it's been really great talking to you. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. And
thank you for having
me. Maybe we'll have the chance to catch up again.
Definitely.
Thanks a lot.
CAE Pilot Podcast is brought to you by CAE, the global leader in training for the civil aviation, defense and security, and healthcare markets. For more information, check out cae.com.